Good evening, and thanks for joining us tonight to talk about Virginia's Student Growth Percentiles. First of all, we'd like to thank all of our teachers out there for inspiring our youth and volunteering their time and their efforts to join a very noble occupation. We'd also like to thank you for joining us to learn more about student growth measures, SGP in Virginia, and value-added measures elsewhere. We're going to talk about four things tonight on the agenda. The first is a short intro video from the Virginia Department of Education on SGP data. They can present a better introduction than virtually anybody else, so I'm not going to waste anybody's time and let you just see the video. Some of you may have watched the trailer before, but we're going to run through that again. Then we'll see a presentation on SGP scores and why they matter. Then we're going to see SGP score analysis briefing. And finally, we'll end up with the data. We'll show you rankings and more. Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, we're having a little technical difficulties with the presentation. If I can't get it going in just about 30 seconds, then I'll um, do the presentation live. So just 1 second. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. Had a few technical difficulties. This is the first time I've done a presentation live, but we should have the video or the presentation up, and we'll walk through it. It is online. If you go to the link below, give me about 30 seconds to confirm it's showing, and then we'll start from there. Okay. Looks like it's showing now. So we'll just do this presentation live. I had intended to do it recorded, so it would come out a little bit better, but obviously the technical difficulties are giving me a little bit of problems, and I appreciate the patience. So this presentation is on why SGPs matter. So teachers are our most valued resource in education. Great teachers, defined as those one standard deviation above the average on student growth measures, can increase the lifetime earnings of their classroom by over $250,000, according to Harvard and Stanford researchers. On the flip side, an ineffective teacher can lower classroom earnings by the same amount. And this effect occurs every year that a teacher is in the classroom. It's imperative that we properly evaluate the performance of our educators. Everyone will acknowledge there are problems when we compare achievement scores of students with different backgrounds. SOL scores in and of themselves have weaknesses, and we can acknowledge that. Kids start with a different knowledge base. They come from different levels of income and poverty, and they have different levels of parental involvement. And quite simply, kids just learn at different rates. We don't want to compare teachers using overall SOL scores alone, since their students can have very different backgrounds. School achievement scores are highly correlated with income. In Colorado, where SGPs originated, all schools with less than 25% economically disadvantaged students had higher overall scores than schools with greater than 75% disadvantage. So if you look on the picture or on the slide, here on the bottom right are the districts that are have poor families and communities. On the left are the ones that are more affluent. The scores for a district in this group is always going to be higher than the scores over here, and that's based mainly on income, regardless of the effect of the teachers. This means the performance on SOL scores is more related to the affluence of the community than the quality of the teaching. However, there is virtually no correlation with student growth percentile scores. You can see there's high student growth scores both in the affluent as well as the poor districts, as well as low scores. Both high and low growth occurs in affluent areas and in areas of poverty. The question is, how can we use growth measures to make an apples-to-apples comparison of our districts, schools, and teachers? SGP scores can help. SGP scores show how much learning was imparted to students after you account for other factors, such as income, prior knowledge, and parental involvement. The bottom line, it's a more apples-to-apples comparison than just SOL scores alone. So here's an example. We commonly assume that the District of Columbia has a much worse school district than Loudoun County. We primarily assume that because of their standardized test scores. But what is the cause of those low scores? Is it the schools? Is it the students? Is it the parents? Or are there other factors? How do we compare the teachers and the staff of the District of Columbia schools with those of Loudoun County? And what if we swap the teachers and the staff of Loudoun with those of DC? Would the Loudoun scores drop to the current scores of DC? Or would the District of Columbia scores increase with our Loudoun's teachers and staff to the current scores of the students of Loudoun today? Nobody honestly believes the scores would flip. Loudoun scores would remain high, and the District of Columbia scores would remain lower. So we are left with the question, how do we fairly and accurately evaluate any Virginia school district when the income levels vary so much? It's not fair to just use SOL scores alone when poverty and affluence are the major factor. The answer lies in using growth measures like SGP. The next question is, are growth measures reliable measurements at all? How can one know if value-added metrics are reliable indicators of teacher effectiveness? If we could set up a thought experiment where we moved highly effective teachers from one school to another, we might measure the resulting scores at each school, both before and after they left. If the departing school had stable scores prior to the teacher's departure, we might ask what effect did the teacher's departure have on those scores? If the arriving school had stable scores before the effective teacher arrived, what effect did the teacher's arrival at that school have on their scores? Likewise, can we see changes in scores when an ineffective teacher transfers among schools? What are the results when we expand the analysis not just to one teacher being transferred, but across a large set of teacher transfers and student test scores? If we could answer these questions, we could scientifically answer the question, do teachers have a significant impact on student test scores, separate and apart from individual student characteristics? Do the teachers have a reliable influence, or is it just random fluctuations? Well, fortunately, the Gates Foundation has invested large amounts of funding to study these very questions. They found that indeed, departing highly effective teachers caused the departing school's test scores to drop. The arriving schools saw a similar gain. The opposite was also true. When ineffective teachers switched schools, the departing schools saw an increase in their scores, while the arriving school witnessed a drop. Other states who have utilized value-added measures, such as Tennessee, have measured these same effects. This is no longer a thought experiment. It confirms that teacher effectiveness varies from teacher to teacher, and it plays a significant role in student outcomes. In summary, teacher effectiveness has been shown to be the single greatest factor in student achievement. It's greater than class size, school facilities, school leadership. While 99% of teachers were rated as effective in virtually every single district in Virginia, SGP scores for students span the gamut from 0 to 100%. Such teacher effectiveness, when you aggregate their student scores together, has a much greater effect than class sizes, which at best have marginal gains in the early grades at huge cost. If you were to lower class sizes by 10%, say from 28 to 25 students, that would cost 10% higher expenditures across the board for very minimal gains. Whereas we've already talked about the influence an effective teacher can have. As a parent, I would rather have a highly effective teacher for my child than virtually any other factor in their education. In summary, much more information, links, and research can be found at the Twitter handle at #FreeThatData. It's time to make this data available to the public, the value-added measures in SGP, and to utilize SGP data in evaluating and improving our schools. Okay, that completes the first presentation on why SGP matter. Next, we're going to get into the release of data. So like I said, the first presentation was SGP scores and why they matter. Next, we're going to go into an analysis briefing. In the analysis portion, as you recall from the previous briefing, school achievement scores are highly correlated with income. In Colorado, all schools with less than 25% economically disadvantaged students had higher overall test scores than schools with greater than 75% disadvantage. However, there's virtually no correlation with student growth percentile scores. The following table shows various combinations of achievement and growth. Some of these actual Virginia districts have both high achievement and high growth. Districts A, B, C, and D all scored in the top 6 or 7 SGP rankings for both math and reading across Virginia. Some districts have rather low achievement but high growth. You can see districts E, F, and G are not getting the credit they so justly deserve. Their SOL scores are much lower than the districts in A, B, C, and D, but they have very high growth ranks of 6, 8, and 13. Sorry about that. I'm going to start over again. I apologize for all the technical difficulties, but the slides, I have a little trouble getting those to come through. So in the analysis briefing, we looked at this slide, which shows the correlation of income and school achievement scores and growth. As you recall, the achievement scores are not correlated to, the achievement scores are correlated to income, whereas the growth measures are not. Here is the slide that shows the district's achievement scores and their growth scores. Some of these are actual, all of these are actual Virginia districts, and some have both high achievement and high growth. You notice district A, B, C, and D all have very high SOL rankings, and they have very high SOL average scores. But they also have high SGP scores relative to the other districts. You can see the rankings range from 1 to 6. And in fact, all districts A, B, C, and D scored in the top 6 or 7 districts across the nation in the growth measures for both reading and for math. Some of the districts have rather low achievement scores, but actually high growth. Districts E, F, and G are not getting the credit they so justly deserve. Their SOL scores are much lower than districts A, B, C, and D, but their growth percentages of 6, 8, and 13 are still relatively high. They are imparting, these teachers and administrations are working with disadvantaged students, and they're working miracles. They're actually teaching them and improving their knowledge bases. But if you just looked at it from the outside for the achievement scores, you would think that they were underperforming. And finally, District H is an example of a high-performing district with very low growth. Its SOL ranking is 30 places higher than its growth measure ranking. So it has an SOL rank of 8, but its growth measure is 37, because there's a big disconnect there. And this disconnect is one of the highest in all of Virginia. Typically, the administration of such a district may be focused on the wrong priorities. Without SGP scores, it is impossible to discover districts such as these who are not serving their advantaged students very well. So in an affluent community who has high SOL scores, one would never know that their growth is actually low unless you release the growth scores. On this slide, you will see the names of the districts mentioned previously. Everyone is aware of the great schools in Fairfax, but folks might be surprised to learn that Prince William, whose pure pupil spending is among the lowest in Northern Virginia, has such high growth scores. And Roanoke is outstanding both in achievement and in growth. But the real credit should go to districts like Manassas City, Roanoke City, and Hampton City Schools. These educators have stepped up to the plate and are making a huge difference in the lives of their disadvantaged youth. But from the outside, not many people would give them credit. Their administrators and their teachers are doing a remarkable job. And lastly, we come to a district such as York County. It has among the top achievement scores in the state, demonstrating there is outstanding human capital in its students. But the administration hasn't lived up to expectations in terms of academic growth. I imagine things will be turning upwards for York County since they recently acquired a new superintendent. I hope the district that hired York's last superintendent bothered to look at the growth scores before hiring him. Or at least the new district should consider the growth scores when they evaluate the policies that the ex-York superintendent will propose for his new county. To better visualize the achievement versus growth spectrum, the same districts are mapped on a scatter plot comparing achievement and growth. You can easily tell which ones are outstanding in every way. The districts in green are high in both achievement and growth. The blue districts are doing amazing work with disadvantaged kids. Even if they never reach the high achievement quadrants to the right, they are making significant differences in the lives of children and would be highly commended. Their growth scores are among the highest in the state. Some might even say that educators in the green, blue, and black districts are being underpaid, since the value they add to their students' future incomes is enormous. As we referenced in the previous briefing, if you have a teacher with one standard deviation above the average, she increases her classroom's lifetime earnings by $250,000. And if we look at red district, it simply has not lived up to the potential of its students. They obviously have high achievement, but they're not growing as rapidly as the other districts in their academic knowledge. To confirm a district's progress, we should look at their scores over time and not just one snapshot. Districts like Fairfax consistently perform well on both achievement and growth over time. You can see their rankings at the bottom. Both their SOL rankings and their SGP rankings have been high and remain so. Districts like Hampton City and Bedford County have made amazing gains. If you look at Hampton City, for example, its growth measure started out at 18 and it moved up to between 1 and 13. Its growth measure in reading started out at 30 and has consistently moved up among the top 10. That's an amazing performance in just 3 years. Its achievement scores have moved up slightly, but they're still not among the highest. And that's an indication that they are simply working in poor neighborhoods. But they very well deserve the credit for doing a remarkable job in terms of student growth. The same thing for Bedford County. It started out with the 43rd growth score in the state, but it is which is toward the bottom of about 40 or 45 districts. It has since moved up to number 3 in math. And in reading, it has remained in the higher levels of the growth scores. But finally, York County's trend over time confirms that something was amiss in its policies. Both math and reading scores dropped over the last 3 years in terms of their growth ranking. If we look at York County's math, it started as 11th and has since moved down to 20th. And in the reading, it started low in the 33 compared to about 40 to 45 districts and has moved down toward the absolute bottom. Parents and citizens need growth data so that they can understand when problems lie beneath the surface. But the real credit should go to districts like Manassas City, Roanoke City, Hampton City, and Bedford. These are the educators who have stepped up to the plate and are not getting the credit they so justly deserve. Since I am from Loudoun County, I wanted to take a second and use my county scores as an example. You'll see that Loudoun's achievement scores are high as seen by median math SOL scores. Loudoun is represented by the orange bar inside the blue bar, so it's among the second highest group of districts in its achievement scores. However, Loudoun is actually below average in student growth in mathematics. Its median SGP score is among the lower half of the districts in the state for math. We hope to see this growth move upwards in the years by implementing better policies and by hiring highly effective teachers. You'll see that Loudoun's reading achievement scores and its student growth are both high on these charts. So not only does Loudoun have among the highest reading scores as you would expect for an affluent community, but its growth is also very high. This means that Loudoun's policies and its teachers are very effective in imparting academic knowledge to students with a large amount of human capital. But we see from these diverging scores that it is possible to have different outcomes among various subject areas. Loudoun is very high in reading, but its growth is mediocre in math. Recruiting more STEM majors to its teacher ranks might be a way to improve Loudoun's overall performance, strengthening its mathematics instruction. Teacher effectiveness has been shown to be the single greatest factor in student achievement, greater than class size, school facilities, school leadership, etc. While 99% of teachers were rated as effective in virtually every single district in Virginia, SGP scores run the gamut. The U.S. Department of Education, the Virginia Department of Education, and educational foundations like the Gates Foundation, have all urged districts to use objective growth measures in the evaluations of teachers and principals. In fact, funding via the Secondary Education Act requires that growth measures be used when available and appropriate. We say available and appropriate. They have to be available for the teacher that taught the class. So if you taught social studies and there's no SOL score, it's not relevant to you and it would not be used. SGPs would not be used in your evaluation. And when it's appropriate, you have to have a sufficient number of scores before you can evaluate a teacher. If you have 5 scores from 1 year, that's not sufficient. But if you have 50 scores over a period of 2 or 3 years, then it becomes much more reliable. But unfortunately, our districts are not doing this. And if current VDOE ESEA waiver is approved at the federal level, our growth data will be further watered down. The Virginia Department of Education is trying to remove student growth percentiles from its calculations. It wants to show if the student has made growth, it will give you credit, the teacher in the school credit for that. If the student has dropped in its scores, it doesn't want to report that at all. So it's kind of a heads I win situation, tails I don't lose. And the question is, can we afford to allow this critical data to be hidden from the public and omitted from educator evaluations? I want to take a note to put a disclaimer. Please note that growth measures should never, ever be used as the only measure of effectiveness. Research suggests that they should count for between 20% and 50% of overall evaluation scores. The Gates Foundation has invested in research that recommends in-person evaluations of a teacher to be the primary factor in evaluations, objective growth measures to have a significant component, and student surveys also to have a minor component. But all of these together will play a role in evaluating our educators. Okay, the reason why everybody showed up tonight was to see the data for the students in the districts and the schools across Virginia. But before I'm going to release the data, I want to make some disclaimers that were both provided by VDOE and are based on the analysis that you will see tonight. So first of all, this data has been publicly available since the Virginia Department of Education released it to me on February the 4th. They've since provided a follow-up drop of the data on February 11th that had revised information. The lawyers who are aware that they could request this data via FOIA at any time after February 4th probably didn't know what to do with the data. And the tech analysts who have wanted to analyze it probably really didn't realize that FOIA allowed them to request it after February the 4th. I've intentionally not made this fact known that the data was available because I wanted to take the time to analyze it and to make sure the results were reliable before releasing it out. I understood that other people may acquire the data and release it ahead of me, but I was unwilling to do a cursory review and just push data out the window so fast. VDOE is charging me over $1,000 to write the code to produce the data from their database. However, now that that code has been written, anyone can request similar data from the Virginia Department of Education for free, since all they have to do is run the code and produce your results. I will also be placing all of the data I have received in an online folder for others to analyze. Since there are over 6 million records, the spreadsheets limit the data that is shown. However, I will be placing an export of my database schema that others can import for their own analysis. Simply import the database schema, you load the test data, it has all of my calculations in it, and you are free to manipulate those as well as additional ones for your own analysis. Hopefully this should expedite everyone's analysis as much of the calculations and data mappings are already done for you. There's been conjecture that people were looking to make a profit from this data, but obviously with the data being free, imperfect competition prevents anybody really from making a profit. So nobody is in the business of making a profit from any of this data. It's solely to spread the information to the teachers, the schools, and the districts on how to improve. Some additional points to note: data were from the records that were given to me by the Virginia Department of Education when student identity could be compromised. Thus, groups with less than 10 students, for example, a 3rd grade math class at a small school, were not provided by VDOE. And that's understandable. But as we'll see, it doesn't make a significant difference in the analysis. The data also includes retest scores. So if a student took a test and then took multiple retests, they are included in the data. All of my analysis tonight did not include any of these retest scores, to simplify the analysis. Additional records were suppressed by VDOE when it was deemed they would paint an inaccurate picture of the school that was instructing the student. For example, if you had a transfer student and he transferred from one school to the other, it may be unclear which one provided the greatest impact on his scores. So those records were withheld. Another set of data disclaimers. We're going to get to the data in just a second, guys. The following points are related to the analysis that I am releasing tonight, not to the VDOE data, but the analysis tonight. Many will look solely at the overall rankings, but I encourage you to dig deeper into all of the various calculations. I don't plan to review them all here tonight, but you will find the different measures interesting. Please note that the SGP scores provided by VDOE do not have a median score of 50. The SGP calculation algorithm is open source, but I have not researched why the median is slightly off. One would imagine when you're doing percentiles that range from 1 to 99, the median should be 50, but they're less than 50. However, when you're comparing relative rankings among schools and districts, the actual median of individual student scores are not important. The relative performance is what is significant. And we'll go over all of this in terms of the data analysis in just a few minutes. Finally, there are additional detailed tabs of the spreadsheet. These have different ratios that you may want to see. If you are interested in how a particular district or school performed at various SOL performance levels, see the group files, which start with GRP underscore. For example, the group analysis can be used to investigate which districts did the best job at educating underperforming kids. For example, kids who achieve pass basic in the SOL category or pass proficient. So it breaks it down into those categories. And that can be obviously very useful in looking for example, for poverty, high poverty areas, which districts are doing the best at educating those kids. And hopefully the districts would share best practices among each other. Okay, this first slide that we're going to look at represents the data that was suppressed by VDOE. And it's obviously important because it tells us how much data we received and whether the data the results are going to be reliable. So on this slide, the blue stack bars represents the number of records that were provided. You notice on the end of the course, it had over 1.6 million. On the grade 3 through grade 8, it ranged from about 1 million down to 600,000. Obviously a very reliable data set. The red bars represent the number of records that were suppressed. So all of these are very low. And then finally, the yellow translucent bars represents the percent of the records that were suppressed. I never received any of these records. But if you'll notice, all of them are basically less than 6%, and they're typically about 3% of the records. So if you're analyzing 97% of the records, it's going to be highly reliable. Furthermore, the data that was suppressed are merely those who transferred between schools or missing some other factors. So it's not going to be skewed toward one end of the population or the other. So nothing in the data suppression should invalidate the analysis. The second slide shows the availability of the SGP scores. As you recall, not all students receive an SGP score. If the students don't have a sufficient score history, the SGP is not calculated for them. In the video they talked about, it looked at similar kids who had scored the same SOL score in the past. In grade 3, since that's your first SOL score, it's impossible to compare against previous scores because there are none. So there's no SGP scores calculated for anybody in the 3rd grade. In the same way, for the end of course classes, a lot of those courses have a different timing. They're not necessarily taken immediately after the 8th grade, or some may be taken at different periods. So there's very few SGP scores related to the end of course tests. Because of the distribution of the SGP scores, with most of the scores for the end of course not having an SGP calculation, I did not include those in any of my analysis. Neither did I include, obviously, grade 3. The end of course doesn't track well with the yearly student gains, and there's just simply too few scores relative to the test taken to make assessments from those scores. But for the remaining years in the test, about 80% of the records have an SGP score. I've heard some comments from different officials, particularly in Loudoun, saying that we're just simply missing too much data to make an analysis. If you have 80% of the records, you can clearly make some reliable analysis. In addition, most of the scores that we're missing are caused by multiple years of advanced proficient scores. I also, since I had individual student records, I also conducted some analysis on the advanced proficient scores and attempted to look at what's called like the flow of students coming and going to the advanced proficient status. How many students moved up into advanced proficient status from lower levels of achievement? And how many moved down from advanced proficient status in 1 year to a lower level of performance in the following year? You'll find this in the spreadsheets under the advanced proficiency tabs of the group files. It's spelled out ADV space PROF in those calculations. Lastly, I wanted to discuss the median SGP scores in the data. As you recall, that we discussed that the median is not 50 in the overall scores. So here's a histogram of all the SGP scores of the individual students. And you'll notice that the map is pretty straight across, which is something that we would expect. There's obviously these tails on the end, but it doesn't spike up too high. In other words, it's less than double the percentile of any other one. So even if you have 30,000 1% in the reading, there's 20,000 at the SGP percentile 2, and it's not going to skew the results. The median SGP of all the math scores is 48. The median SGP for reading is 44. One would expect both of those to be 50. I spoke to the Virginia Department of Education for 45 minutes to determine why the data was distributed like it was in the above chart. They offered a couple of explanations about multiple years of score history and how they may not track all the students. It's still unclear to me exactly why the distribution is what it is. The SGP calculation software is open source, and I and others plan to inspect it in more detail to figure out why. I have a feeling that some floor function, in other words, if you have a range of say like 45 to 50 that you could put your value in, it always set it to 45, may have been used on some percentiles, thus skewing the data. But this is purely conjecture. Overall, the relative rankings won't be affected. So if a district, for example, if one district has a 44 median SGP, then it's about average. If another district has a 47, it will clearly be higher than the district who had the median of 44. The critical factor here is you can't look at the median SGP of a district and assume it's underperforming simply because it's below 50. You need to look at its relative ranking when the scores are aggregated up by school or by district compared to the other districts. And that's the best way to analyze the data. So this is one of the most important charts in the briefing. You'll also notice that there's a jagged nature of the curve. If you had evenly distribution of percentiles, you would expect that overall it to be flatter. Some of the data that was suppressed is obviously going to be taken from certain percentiles and not from others, and it would cause slight deviations. But overall, it's a very stable and flat line, even if there's a little slope to the reading line, which can be accounted for if you take relative medians. In summary, much more information, links, and research can be found at the Twitter handle @FreeThatData. This has all the reference documents I talked about, including the RAND Corporation study, which is one of the best sites. There's a link on the left of the Twitter handle there that you can go to. There's also links to the GATE studies, as well as a lot of other organizations that put out great articles, such as Teach Plus, Students First, Data Quality Campaign. I encourage you to look at the followers of this Twitter handle. It's interesting that some of our administrators are very active on Twitter, but can't seem to follow some of these organizations that use data in education to make analysis. You have 1,500, if you're following 1,500 different organizations, but can't follow the Data Quality Campaign, I guess it raises the question is, do you plan to use data in any of your educational analysis? Okay. That concludes the presentation portions of the demonstration. Next, I'm going to bring up the actual analysis, and we'll walk through what some of that information entails. Just 1 second. So once again, we've done the score analysis briefing. Now we'll do the data rankings. I'm going to take a second, given our previous difficulties, just to make sure the information is being projected. You can give me just 1 second. Okay, there we go. It's clearly showing. Apologize for the delay, guys. This is my first time doing a web conference on Google Hangouts. And we'll edit this video up so when other people watch it, it'll be a little bit cleaner and can re-release it. Okay, here are the counts that we showed. It's got the SGP, SOL counts. One other caveat is there were 2 sets of data released. There was one on February the 4th and another on February 11th. February 11th had additional records. However, in both sets of data, there were duplicate records. In other words, there would be a record that had the exact same information for the anonymous student ID, the school, the SGP score, the SOL score, everything. Sometimes there was 1 record like that. Sometimes there were 2. Sometimes there were 4. Sometimes there was 10. So obviously, that may slightly affect the median. So all of the analysis you're seeing right now has unique records. In other words, all the duplicates were stripped out. I've been in touch with the Virginia Department of Education to have them rerun their analysis to verify the records and send us a new data load. And I sent them the algorithm I used to strip out the duplicate records. However, please note, I've conducted 3 sets of calculations, one on the original February 4th drop, one on the February 11th drop, and now with these unique records. All of them have shown that basically the district's in the exact same order with highly consistent median SGP scores. So the fact that you have slight differences in the data sets may move the curve up or down, but it doesn't affect the overall rankings of these. In the spreadsheet, you'll be able to see very detailed analysis of how many records counts there were for each. These are the records that were provided. These are the records that are suppressed. Overall, here are the subtotals, and as you can see, the percent suppressed across all the tests are pretty low. Here's the chart that was used to generate the available scores, where the SGP is available and when the SGP is not available. All of the SGP of the growth analysis was calculated only on the records for which SGP scores were available. So for example, if you're looking at an average SOL score and an average or a median SGP score, the SOL score wasn't calculated from all of the records. It was only calculated from the 80% of the records that had SGP scores, for example. And here is a list of all the counts by individual percentile for both reading and math. You notice they all have basically 10,000 records each. So at 10,000 records, you're no longer dealing with just a handful of records here or there. Okay, next, I'm going to show a different chart. This is going to be the main data chart that everybody will be interested in. Once again, I'm going to take a second to allow it to come up. There's a slight delay in the YouTube feed, so I'm going to verify it's coming through on YouTube. You're probably going to see it before then, so there'll be a little delay while the feedback occurs. But given my technical problems, I'd rather. Okay, there we go. I know it's a little small. I'm going to move these files over as soon as we finish the presentation. So if you notice, there's a bunch of tabs down here across the bottom. And it starts with more high-level data and goes to more detailed level data. Here is what we call the division summary. And so it provides a relative ranking based on the median SGP score of that district. And it goes from 1, for math, it goes from 1 all the way down to 41 districts. And for reading, there are 43 districts. You'll notice some color-coded rankings in here. So the light green are those that scored in the top 25%. So if you rank everything, obviously you can download these spreadsheets and sort them any way you want. But if you rank them by the SGP median score, obviously the top quarter is going to be in green and the bottom quarter is going to be in orange. However, you'll notice that the SOL rankings are not the same. You have some high-performing districts that actually had lower growth and some low achievement districts. Like, for example, Hampton City had a 33 on its achievement, but it scored number 7 in its ranking. Those are the star performers that we want to highlight. Over here is a calculation that is called the SOL rank minus the SGP rank. And independent of income, generally if you have higher growth, you will tend to move up the achievement ladder slightly. But what this really highlights is, do you have poor and disadvantaged communities who are showing remarkable growth and should be given credit for having their teachers and administrators going down and performing miracles? Those are the ones in green. The ones in dark red are the ones who are very affluent and have high achievement, but are not seeing the kind of results that either the poor communities have, or frankly, some of the top achievers, such as Fairfax or Roanoke, are achieving, who have both high achievement and high growth. And you'll see a couple of counties down here. The bottom two and the top two are highlighted. The reading and the math scores are separated differently. Also, you'll notice that, and there's a legend to the bottom that shows what the color codings and the rankings are. The ones that are in bold are in the top 7 or 8 of the rankings in both reading and math. So just to give a shout out to Fairfax County, Arlington County, Stafford, Prince William, Roanoke, Manassas City, and Wise County. All of them were in the top 7 or 8 in both groups. I've also taken some, it's a little bit older data in FY12, but showing you the per pupil spending. And so you notice there's a big difference. Arlington County, high cost of living, but they spend almost $19,000 per pupil. Prince William is getting nearly similar results with $10,380. They spend among the least of all the districts in Northern Virginia. Stafford County also spent $9,700 in 2012. So again, this is the rankings. Let me go through just quickly what the columns are. The median SOL score, this means of all your students who had a valid SGP score, remember that's about 80% of the scores, what was the median in your district? Not the average, but the median. And then we rank that median compared to all the other districts. These districts obviously are not all the ones in Virginia. But the idea was, hey, let's take a minimum number of scores from say 8,000 or 5,000 individual scores before we'll rank them. And these were across multiple years. Obviously, if you have smaller districts, they can have outliers. They can have very high SGP scores or very low, and they're going to skew the data. You're welcome, obviously, for the folks who have the database, to include all the different districts. But I chose to say, hey, let's kind of take the similar districts against each other and have kind of an apples to apples comparison. Here's the median SGP score. Again, of all the 80% of scores in that district who had an SGP calculated, what was the median? And then we simply ranked that median against each other. Here's the difference in rank. The SGP ratio is another calculation that I created. Virginia Department of Education reports the SGP scores in 3 different categories. And in the teacher evaluations, a lot of that's how it's recommended to be used. So you have high growth, that's a SGP score for an individual student of 65 or above. A low growth would be 35 percentile or below. And a moderate growth would be between 35 and 65%. This SGP ratio looks at how many students had a high growth versus low growth compared to all the scores. And if you'll notice, there's a note in these that you can look at to see what the actual calculation was. So in this calculation, for example, you get 3 points if you have a student with high growth, 2 points if you have a student with moderate growth, and 1 point if you have a student with low growth. You add up the high growth students, you add up all their points, and then you divide by the total number of students. And it should average out to be around 2. But given that the median SGP is slightly lower, the average is going to be slightly lower. Any school with a score of 2 or higher is going to be very high. Any school with a score lower than, say, like 1.8 or 1.85 is going to have a lower. So it's not quite the same as the median SGP, but it's just a different calculation. The notes are not in every tab across the spreadsheet. It's generally on the first one. Next, we'll go to the division details. So if you'll notice, this has a lot more numbers across the chart. And again, some information at the top. Total rankings, meaning how many districts were included in this analysis. The sheets will have different numbers, but on this sheet, there were 41 different districts in math, 43 different districts in reading, and the minimum number of scores you had to be included in this calculation was 5,000 for math and reading. So the districts with lower scores are just simply not included. Other people can include those in the calculation. So we have basically the same information across the top as the summary slide. And then I'm going to run through quickly on this slide the other calculations that are included. These are basically included in most of the tabs. So we have the average SOL score as opposed to the median. This is the average. We have the maximum SOL score. Typically for a lot of districts, that's going to be 600. If any student that scores 600, that'll be your score. The minimum SOL score, the mod, most common SOL score. Then we have the average SGP score, a max SGP score, min, mod, score count. How many different scores did they have in the district? Again, this has to meet the 5,000 threshold to be included. Then we have the SGP high ratio. How many students achieved high growth relative to your overall percentage of students? Obviously, this should add up to 1, right? The high, moderate, and low growth. So obviously, a county like Roanoke, who did amazingly well, has 41% of its students, nearly 42% scoring in high. That's a really amazing score. Then over here, we had different rankings. So the first rank, we talked about the rankings before. We had the median SOL and median SGP. Here we have a ranking based on the average SOL, average SGP, rank based on the SGP ratio. And you can take a look, but the SGP ratio is a slightly different calculation, but it's very consistent. So that's one of the things that proves the reliability of the data. Is a lot of the different calculations have the same kind of ordering effects. Here is a ranking based on what percentage of your students were in the high growth area. Here, what percentage are in your low growth or moderate growth, and then what percentage were in your low growth. And there's not a great the moderate growth. For the low growth, you scored well if you had a small number of your students who were in the low ratio. In the high growth, had a high number in your ratio. For the moderate, these rankings are not going to be that relevant because your moderate is basically in the middle. But you can scale down and you can see all your different districts. Okay, here's the histogram. If you notice, we had charts in the presentation based on the histogram. And typically, you expect to see a fairly normal distribution of scores across the district. Here you can see the math SOL is fairly normal. It's fairly well behaved with lower tails. And again, you can set up different bins or different buckets by which you want to score it. But typically, both of these scores are going to have a large number of districts in the middle and then tail off on either side. This is the SGP. The orange simply represented where my county, Loudoun, represented. Again, in the math, they had high SOL scores, but for math, it was below average in the growth. And then for the reading, Loudoun had both a high SOL score and a high growth measure. One other note, here are the median and the standard Ds for both the SOL and the SGP. This is not for all the individual student scores, or this is for the students that were included in this analysis, right? So you can see that the standard deviation for the SOL is about 10 points for score 436. For the SGP, you have a standard deviation about 3.5 percentile points with an average about 43. Average, the mean and the standard deviation for all of these kind of subset of the overall scores. So it's not all the scores in the entire database. The next is we're going to look at the division year. In other words, we separate out each individual school year, and then we rank them based solely on that data. So obviously, you're going to have fewer scores. So the minimum scores to meet this threshold is 1,500 in math and reading. And here's the total number of districts that were ranked. So about the low 40s for each math and reading. And you'll notice that a lot of the districts stayed the same. So, Roanoke continues to score high in all of the different years. So it's number 2 in 2012 and 13, and continuing on down. I won't go through all the data because you can, I'm going to move it over to the public folder and you can analyze all that as soon as we're done talking. Finally, the schools. Not only did the districts, we did the schools. So here are the rankings of the different schools. So one of the amazing things we found out is that some of these schools that did really well are obviously known. So Fairfax County has a whole bunch of schools in the very top ranked schools. But some of the smaller districts, or the districts that didn't, whose achievement scores weren't that great, Manassas Park City, Manassas in general did amazingly well, even though their achievement scores weren't that high. Same with Roanoke and Roanoke City. In fact, a lot of people are familiar with great schools. I picked out 4 or 5 schools whose great schools ranking didn't really mesh with how they looked in this growth data. So for example, Manassas Park in Manassas had a great schools ranking of 5, but it was near the top of our schools in terms of growth. So in terms of the quality of teaching and what those administration teachers are doing, it's truly amazing. I think Grace E. Metz Middle School in Manassas had a great schools ranking of 4. Again, they were near the top of our rankings. Aberdeen Elementary in Hampton City had a great schools ranking of 2, but they were also near the top of their rankings. So in terms of growth, those are the educators and the administrators who really need to get credit, because I imagine up until this point, without this data, there's no way anybody realized the amazing things that they were doing in those schools. And George P. Phoenix Elementary School in Hampton City also had an amazing school. They had a score of 6 in the great schools, but obviously they had a great ranking here. I don't want to go through all the different schools, obviously, but you can take a look and obviously resort the table as you want. Again, everything is ranked based on the median SGP score as the default. The green are highlighted as the top 25%, and it goes down to the orange, which is the lower 25%. Here are the details of the different schools. Again, it has the same calculations as above. The calculations aren't detailed. Go to the first tab of each sheet to see the results. For the schools, they had to have a minimum 300 scores in math and reading. And there were 1,142 schools ranked in the math, 1,104 ranked in the reading. Here's a histogram of those schools. So basically, we took their median SOL score and their median SGP score, set up buckets, and this helps to evaluate the reliability of the data. So first, we'll look at the median SOL histogram, and it looks very normal. It's got a little bit longer tails, but it's basically a normal or Gaussian distribution where you have high in the middle and then it tails off on both sides. So most schools do about the same, or a lot of schools are centered in the middle. The growth scores actually look the exact same way. So most of the median growth scores of the districts or the schools are going to be centered here in the middle. And the same is true for the reading scores. We'll scroll down here. So this is the SOL score, very similar to a Gaussian distribution, and the same in the growth scores. Once again, the mean and the standard deviation are down here. You'll notice that the standard deviations are going to be higher for the schools than they were for the districts. Obviously, that's because you have a larger sample size in the districts, so you're going to kind of get a convergence around the expected value of each school. But still, it's very well behaved in terms of an SGP score of 44 and 6 for the reading, 437 and 15 for the SOL score for the reading. If you were to use this at a lower level, say at the teacher level, you're obviously going to get a higher standard deviation for both of these. And that's one reason why VDOE recommends a minimum number of scores. Typically, I think they like to get 40, and they like to get it across multiple years. All of these aggregate data for the school and the division histograms use 3 years worth of data, and we showed the minimum counts that they had up above. The VDOE teacher guidelines recommends using at least 2 years of data and trying to get at least 40 scores so that you have reliability. Obviously, it would be highly recommended that the VDOE puts out what the average and the standard deviations for those scores are, so that administrators and schools can know how much reliability or how much confidence they can place in those. Finally, we'll look at this has the school year by detail, so it has all the other calculations and rankings in there, and it has it by year. So you can track your school by year and see if it's been improving or if it's been moving down in the rankings. That completes that chart. So now we'll jump back to the main slide, and I'm going to show the group rankings. I'm going to take just a second to make sure that gets shown. Okay. I see it on the feedback loop. I know there was a little bit of delay. I apologize once again, but the technical difficulties, I just wanted to make sure it came up. So here, for example, is the division scores, but instead of doing it solely by all the students together, it's broken down into SOL proficiency. So you can see a ranking of schools or divisions by failed basic. In other words, if they, and there's different cutoff points, the VDE can define these, but basically if they had very low scores, how did the districts compare? Once again, you'll see districts that you don't necessarily commonly associate with being great school districts having very high growth measures. Hampton City is one of the ones that we singled out before. So among the students who did very low achievement, Hampton City achieved remarkable growth and were the #1 ranked school, or #1 ranked district among those kids. Also have failed below basic. Fairfax County was the highest in terms of growth among those districts. So once again, Fairfax County is a stellar performer, both at the high level and the lower levels. And then the pass proficient is probably where the most of the students are. So Manassas City was one of the ones that we highlighted again. Manassas City, I don't even want to pronounce this one so I don't mess it up. And then Hampton City again, even among the pass proficient, they did a good job across. So I'm not sure who's running Hampton City or where their teachers are, but they have obviously an amazing district down there. But once again, I'm just showing you the data. All of the calculations are again defined up here at the top. Just move your bar across it. You can find out what that means. And these are just my calculations, the way I chose to analyze the data. All the data in the databases will be out there for the public to see after tonight. Here we have the division by year. You'll notice there's a smaller count, a minimum score of 1,000 in each of these subgroups to be included. So you're going to have a smaller number of districts. There's not a number of districts that are ranked up here because it would differ depending on what your SOL proficiency are. Here are the schools. You'll notice that we're getting down to smaller sample counts here, 200 for the schools across for a given SOL proficiency and a subject. And then we have all of them ranked here. Fairfax County, again, is a stellar performer, even among their disadvantaged students. School by year. This has the same calculation as the districts, where it shows you groups it by the SOL proficiency and by the year, so you can tell if your district is moving up or down. And I think there's about 6,000 records, 4,000 or 6,000 records, so plenty of records in here. Again, the school had to have a minimum of 100. Compare that to the teacher evaluations, where VDE recommends at least 40. So we always have, in all of these calculations, the 100 was the minimal sample size in any of the calculations. And last, you may have heard me reference the advanced proficiency calculations that I've done. I had individual records for anonymous students, and I had their SOL score and their SGP score, as well as their different categories. So what we did is we looked at the number of students that increased based on from one year to the next, from below advanced proficient to advanced proficient, the number of students that dropped out of it. And then we have an increase to decrease ratio. So how did that compare? And once again, don't look at necessarily, is 54% high? I mean, ideally we would expect one to have, like, say, 80%. But it's really the relative rankings, because once you have a large enough sample size, generally you can discount any bias of the data. Obviously, the reading scores were much higher for all of the districts. Apologize for some of the formatting as I posted in with the different sample sets. And again, this is not meant to be a definitive ranking. It just simply provides more information on advanced proficient scores. Typically, there was no SGPs for most of these scores. Percent moves tells you how many of the students moved either up or down in that year. Score count tells you for a given district how many students did they have who scored in the advanced proficient category, and then obviously the rank, and the rank is set up by both reading and math and by districts. Have the same amount of information for the schools. Again, we have to give you caution here in terms of using the data, as it can help provide, but if there's not as many scores, then you want to just be careful. Manassas City, again, this Gracie Metz was one of the ones that didn't have the highest ranking on great schools, but you can see it ranked first, even among the advanced proficient, for its count, where it had huge numbers of, particularly in math, that increased. So I'm not sure if they got some Teach for America teachers or what they have down there, but obviously they're doing an amazing job. So basically that completes our presentation tonight. I'm going to try to turn on the chat feature to see if anybody has any questions that they may want to ask, and see if I can figure out how to get the chat to work. But also begin to look online. I'm going to remain online for a little bit longer and see if there's any questions that are posted online. I'd be happy to answer them. In the meantime, I'm going to begin moving the files over to that shared public drive. I'm going to move the briefings over first, then I'll move the Excel files, and then I'm going to move the folder that contains the database. It's just a shell of a database. Basically, you'll have all the tables, and it's basically created into a fact table with various dimensions. You have a loader table where the data was loaded into it. I had to archive off a couple of sets of data based on multiple revisions of drops. And then just to give those who want to analyze the data, the SGP scores table is the one that had the latest set of records from VDOE, the February 11th drop. I then ran a procedure. You'll see there's one procedure in there, and you can see how I limited or eliminated the duplicates. Eliminated the duplicates and put the unique records in the table SGP underscore unique, UNIQ underscore scores. So I have materialized views and views that look at both of those fact tables. And the data that you saw here tonight was based on the unique scores, but you can use either set. There's also all of the original data that VDOE provided to me, so you can reload any data set that you want. In fact, the database shell doesn't have all the data in it, or else it would be much larger. I simply created like one record. All of the dimensions are populated, so you don't have to repopulate the dimensions. But the fact tables, where the millions of records, are not included in there. So you should be able to quickly import that database schema and then reload the data files. I also included a control file and a par file for those that are familiar with loading databases, just to speed it along. Obviously, you can do that easily by yourself, but I tried to put as much information out there so we can get as many people looking at it and to share the data. I want to say thanks again to Loudoun County Administration, the school board, and the various PTAs and homeowners associations. I tried to get tried to ask them to host the meeting in one of their facilities, but they constantly rejected our requests, and I think that actually improved things, because we've been able to do this online and share it with more people as it's recorded. But it's pretty clear who wants the data to be shared and who does not want the data to be shared. So I'm going to commence moving the data right now. And I'll try to take a look at your questions as soon as I move it over. Okay, right now, if you go to the folder that was shown on the presentation, the Virginia SOL SGP data folder, you'll see a subfolder under there with presentation files. That has all of the Excel spreadsheets as well as the PowerPoint presentations that we're seeing tonight. So you should see that showing up in just a few seconds. Usually it takes a little while to refresh. Okay, so I'm seeing that on my presentation right now. And I can see all the slides. So you should be able to download those now and play around with those. Now I'm going to move the data, sets of data over. And there's a subfolder that has the previous February, all the information that's in the VDOE SGP data folder. Includes the 16709_v2.zip. That's the latest version of the data that was provided. The export.sql is an export of the schema that you can load into your database to analyze the data. And then there's the two load files that can be used to load the data. Okay. So in my folder, I now see all three files: presentation files, the VDOE briefs, and the VDOE SGP data. One caveat on the VDOE briefs: those were not created by me; those are created by personnel at the Virginia Department of Education, including Dr. Jonas, who, my understanding, spearheaded the SGP effort at the department. She has since left, but a lot of the great presentations and information on there is pretty critical, and will help you out. It also has information on the requirements of the federal government in terms of providing SGP data to teachers. Again, that's not to the public, but the federal rules require school districts to download the data. Most of the school districts across the state are not downloading the data. They've verified that with their FOIA requests. The federal rules require the districts to download the data and to give it to teachers who are actually going to be teaching those students. The federal guidelines also require the statewide growth measures to be used in teacher evaluations when available and appropriate. Obviously for math and English teachers in grades 4 through 8 when there's enough data. If a district's not downloading the data, the SGP data from the Virginia Department of Education, it's impossible for them to be using it in their evaluations. Washington State recently had its funding stripped because it allowed districts to optionally use such data. So the Federal Department of Education removed the funding from the Washington State. I certainly am afraid that may happen to Virginia, particularly as the federal government is reviewing Virginia's practices on that. I think we need to strongly encourage our policymakers to use the data and comply with the rules. This is not an unfunded mandate. People mention that word unfunded mandate. Virginia does not have to comply with the mandates. It can simply refuse the funding. The funding more than pays for the mandate. If it did not, Virginia would clearly simply say, we're going to pay for this ourselves and not be stuck with the mandate. But this is a funded mandate, and Virginia has taken the money and has not complied with the rules and regulations. Again, this presentation will be stored and it'll be put on YouTube. Obviously, all the technical difficulties, I apologize once again at the beginning. I'll try to edit that video to take that part out, and possibly put the other presentations up that were much better in terms of walking through the data. I'm going to look for a couple of questions, but I'm sure people may be reviewing the data right now. Okay, one question that came up is there's been a lot of conversations about the personnel records, and is data going to be released at the teacher level? Obviously, the FOIA request, let me give you a little background on the FOIA request. So that was provided both to Loudoun and to the Virginia Department of Education concurrently, as well as to the Loudoun County School Board, stating that I was interested in looking, once I found out that student growth data was available, I asked it to be released, and I asked it to be released at the school level, the district level, and/or at the teacher level, and was willing to negotiate with the districts and see what they could provide, particularly at aggregated levels. Both the Loudoun basically said that we can't comply with your FOIA request because we have never downloaded the data. We don't plan to download the data, therefore we can't give you any records that comply. From September all the way until the middle of January, resisted downloading the data so that they wouldn't have to comply with a FOIA request. And so there was obviously there's no legal action against Loudoun because you can't force somebody to provide something that they don't have. Whether they should have or whether they were breaking rules by not downloading is a separate question. Virginia Department of Education, the request was, let's put all the data out there and make it available. Virginia Department of Education had won a previous ruling. It wasn't really a formal opinion, where the case was different, but they thought they didn't have to release any data. The Virginia Department of Education puts out average SOL scores for all of its schools, but its position was it did that voluntarily and that no one can force it to put out SOL scores. It just did that because it chose to do so. And the same applied to the data. Originally, I did not ask for the data at the individual student level. I asked for it in aggregated form, similar to how the VUE reports it by the schools on the school report card. But the Virginia Department of Education's position was that they had never created any aggregate data. One would ask, how can you check the reliability of data if you've never aggregated it? But won't go into that now. So once they said that we don't have to give you aggregate data because it has never been created, we followed up with, well, give us the student level data and let us aggregate it. And that's when the legal case came up about what is identifiable. There's a FOIA section of the Virginia Code 3704G that basically says all data in electronic form, if you can excise or basically drop a column or a field in a database that has personally identifiable information, you have to do that and give them the rest that's not identifiable. And that's what the judge decided was the correct reading of the statute. And thus the VDOE was compelled to give us the data. We do have an anonymous ID for the student that cannot be tracked back to the student. And because all of our records for the students have at least 10, a sample size of 10 in them, you can't know any individual SOL score. But as you can see, even for the SGP scores, they're all over the map. So you couldn't really tell significantly what individual student's SGP score, and it wouldn't really make that much difference. It's more for analysis. Okay, it looks like that's all the questions I've had. Again, this data will be, or this presentation will be recorded. I'll try to clean it up. Apologize once again for the jerky and the interruptions in the presentation. But also on the Twitter, if you can follow @FreeThatData, we're going to be giving kudos to various districts and schools who have done a remarkable job. And hopefully everybody will look up their schools and ask hard questions of their officials about their policies and whether those policies are being effective or not. We've seen a lot of districts who have done remarkable jobs and seen improvement. And particularly if you're in an area that has a lot of poverty or an area that has a lot of affluence, and you may not be able to tell the performance of your school, the SGP data is a very reliable indicator. So unless there's any further questions, I will turn off the broadcast, let everybody download and look at the data, and that'll be it for tonight. Again, thanks for your time and attention tonight. See if I can get the last slide up.